Hello everyone, my name is Jakob Schwartz. I'm a grad student here at UNC with the Transatlantic Maths program, and I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Professor Seth. He is an associate professor. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University in New York, and he received his BA from Central College in 1998. Afterwards worked for Toyota's North American headquarters before he began his MA studies at Duke University here in the Research Triangle. In 2006, he also received his PhD from the Political Science Department at Duke University, again like with his BA with honors. And taking into account the years he spent at our wonderful friends at Duke, we are also happy that he is a member of the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, so it's good to have you here as well. After finishing his studies, he worked as a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago in Illinois before becoming an assistant professor at Syracuse University. Professor Sept teaches European politics, comparative political parties, and ethnic conflict, and his main research interests are regional political parties in Europe, political institutions, and political economy as well. He has a very extensive background of publications and lectures, including a wide range of topics, and only to mention a few here: varieties of capitalism and political divides over European integration, location, national contextual factors and public support for European integration, and many, many more. Now we are looking very much forward to his presentation. He's going to speak on the topic Changing Demographics and Xenophobia, how immigrant population change affects public attitudes in Europe. Thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. One of the best things about my grad school experience over at Duke was to have my friends over here at UNC. I took multiple classes over here, and in fact, Gary Marks, who's I think off this semester out away from Chapel Hill, but he was on my committee, and I got a lot of my European education over here. And it was nice to have that balance, but it's always great to come back here. Jacob mentioned some work on Skepticism. If you all want to talk about that in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about that. I've worked on that in others. I won't so much touch on that today, although I do think attitudes towards immigrants feeds into that and plays an important factor. The external European immigration and the internal European integration both play a big role in whether people in different countries support enlargement, for instance, or other things, right? If they're worried about people taking their jobs or they're worried about taking their culture, it affects whether or not you want to integrate. So I'll welcome questions about that. The key with this project about xenophobia and contact, Jacob gave one title. I think I sent a different title. This is a third title. It's partly because it's an ongoing research project. What I'm going to present today is the first kind of finished part of it, but there's a bunch of extensions that I'm thinking about. There's a professor here, Rasan Maxwell, who works on the opposite side. I work on native European attitudes towards immigrants. He works mostly on immigrant attitudes that live in Europe towards both towards their home country and towards other people. And so if you're interested in this, I recommend you go find his stuff. It's really interesting. Part of the story when I first started this a few years ago was birth rates are well known to be stagnating, especially in Western and Northern Europe. And that's a particular problem for countries with really big welfare states, right? They have a tradition of strong welfare. In order to have those strong welfare states, you need people paying taxes. And if the birth rates stagnate, you need to resolve that, right? Some places, like Italy, do things like offer bonuses to women who have multiple kids, right? There's a village in Italy that gives 10,000 euros for each kid if you have the baby, and then it stays there until kindergarten or preschool, right? But that's kind of a short-term solution. Another solution might be immigration, right? There's lots of debates about whether that'll help, but that's one of the ideas. Invite people in to help create a vibrant economy. That's one of the key advantages that the U.S. has historically. Less so now because we're kind of xenophobic a lot these days ourselves. So while policymakers are thinking a lot about immigration, and it's part of the EU story, the public is pretty skeptical of immigration, and particularly skeptical and suspicious of immigrants who don't look like the traditional Northern Europeans, right? So in particular, people from North Africa, people from Turkey, potentially Muslim, Arab, whatever, right? That creates different challenges than what German immigrants to France creates. The problem in political science, at least, is there's not actually all that much research on these attitudes and what shapes them and causes them. And so I'm kind of introducing a little bit of that. So I'll start first, though, by talking about the problem, or the issue, the context, or whatever. This is an example. This is from The Economist a couple of years ago. The graph didn't come out super great, but what you see, this is a simple table showing the Muslim population in selected urban areas. You get Amsterdam, 24% of the population in Amsterdam is Muslim, going down to 16%, 14%, 20% in Marseille. There's a variety of places. Overall, right, the population is pretty small. We're not talking about the kind of minority population that the US has. About 4% of the Europe-wide total is Muslim among the certainly the Western European countries. But there is this heavy concentration in urban areas, which creates different dynamics, right? An example of that would be what kind of food do you feed in schools to your school children, right? Do you feed meat? And if so, do you do it in a way that Muslim children can eat that or not? Or do you ignore it the way like a lot of French politicians would? According to the 1999 census, so about 13 years ago, there were 3 million immigrants in France from outside the European Union, about 4.7%. By 2008, that number had doubled, gone to 6%, right? So relatively modest numbers, but a doubling is a big deal. Of those immigrants, of that, like, let's say 6 million or so, 61% arrive outside the EU 27, right? It's not just Belgians moving over. It's people from other countries, particularly from African countries. So what, you might ask, right? Who cares, right? That's good. It creates vibrancy. There's lots of advantages in diversity. School children get the advantages. There's lots of that. But the problem is it creates different dynamics in the politics. And one of the things that I don't do so much in the paper, but I think is driving my interest in this, is the rhetoric that politicians use in Europe about welfare is integrally tied to immigration. So I'll show one quick political ad from Sweden in 2010 to give you a taste of what they're talking about. It's in Swedish, so you can understand, but you'll get the idea, right? These are the welfare state people. Nice little old Swedish grandma. She's going to get her welfare checks. So this ad is kind of indicative of a particular stream of European politics, right? It's rhetoric that has to be more subtle in the U.S., right? You still get racist ads in the U.S. at times, but it's more like there's an undertone, right? It's more subtle. There's nothing quite like this. There, actually, in the last election, there was some in Texas about Latino immigrants, but this ad was actually banned in Sweden, but it still showed, right? I found it on YouTube pretty easily. That party, the Swedish Democrats, won 5.7% of the vote in about 20 seats. And that is their platform, right? We don't want all these immigrants in here taking away our benefits. They don't frame it in the way, like we need new people paying taxes. Another example, right? Let's go to Switzerland. Is anybody familiar with this? This is one of my favorite horrible ads. It's 3 white sheep kicking 1 black sheep off the Swiss flag, right? You can't get much more direct than that, right? This ad was in August 2007. The Swiss People's Party launched a direct mail campaign at a national level to gather support for, I'll just read it, Federal Popular Initiative for the Deportation of Criminal Foreigners, right? So there's all sorts of things. We're getting rid of foreigners, and it's because those foreigners are criminals, right? The caption reads, to create security, with Schaffen being a pun, this Schaffen, to being a pun on sheep. In Geneva, the city council banned the outdoor campaigns, right? So some elites are trying to restrict this sort of talk. There's definitely that angle. But then you get this other, the radical right, which I know Erica teaches about some, and you probably had, some of you all were probably here for Cosmuta's talk a few weeks ago, right? That's what he studies. He studies these parties that have this kind of thing. This party went from 27% of the vote in 2003 to 29% in 2007. And you get these parties all over Europe with more and less degree. So that's one side of it, right? This dynamic of what politics is going to look like in a lot of European countries with increased diversity, right? And in diversity in a particular way. But that's not the only side, right? The other side is what Rahsaan Maxwell studies, right? The side of the immigrants. How do they feel about their home countries? So in the news not too long ago, you get the Turkish prime minister goes to Germany and deliberately tells them not to integrate into German culture, right? Don't turn into Germans. You're still Turks. You should keep your national loyalty to us. Right? And so there's that idea of, and also, right, the fights over whether women can wear burqas in public in France and Netherlands and other countries. All of these dynamics of the standard Europeans potentially wanting some integration, right? If you're going to be in our country, you need to kind of play by the rules and learn some of the culture and stuff like that. And then the other side, and also you get many of the immigrants are minority in terms of either race or ethnicity, and are often living in areas that are more poor, right? Less education, more cast aside, I guess. And so an example of this from the other side would be the French riots in 2005. So about 8 years ago or so. A sociologist famous from being mentioned in Freakonomics, Sudhir Venkatesh, blogged about these urban riots in France back then. So you get a lot of immigrants, mostly from North Africa. Interviews at that time, like in the 2005 to 2008 range, showed the minority youth to be angry, resentful. They feel discriminated against, right? Angry at unemployment, angry at being excluded, right? They don't hate the French. They want to be part of the club, but they feel like they're not allowed in. So you get these pretty fierce riots. And fortunately, what he feared at the time, Venkatesh, in 2008, he thought it was going to get worse soon. And it actually, there have been riots since in various places, but it hasn't gotten to the stage that he has. The graffiti says stuff like hostages of youth, logical revolts, disorder of things, somber dreams of history, and so on. And you get both sides. So this is where I'm starting from. I'm interested in these issues. I see this in the news, and I want to know kind of what's going on. You get one side of people who are very skeptical and suspicious of immigrants. A colleague of mine at SU, a political geographer, studies Strasburgers. And he interviewed people who said things like, Madame Alphonse says, I think diversity is a good thing. If a human group lives all closed up in its bubble, no. You've got to be confronted with new ideas. It's enriching. You've got to knock up against others. You've got to try to understand them, what's going on. Okay? So that's one side, which is building into what I'm going to talk about. If you interact with people, you start to get to know them. The stereotypes might break down, hopefully. And you might actually find out that people that look different, that act different, that have different culture are not so bad, right? Contrary interviews from his time in Strasbourg, a couple said, we were born here, our ancestors lie here, but when you take the tram into town, you see how the population has changed. You don't see any real Alsatians anymore, right? So there are people down there, but they're not my people, right? And I think the obvious implication of that is there's no chance that they could be my people, right? A retired police inspector in Strasbourg says, they are spread throughout the urban area. They are everywhere in French cities. The real mistake was when we let the women and children in, and that started the families, right? So then they're going to stay, right? If it's just migrant workers, you work for a season, then you go home. And that gave us the bad kids. That was the last part of that story, right? That gave us the crime. That's what the police inspector's saying. So I have both of these things. I go into research interested in racial attitudes and xenophobia. I think in particular in France, it's hard to, like, xenophobia and racial attitudes go together, right? It's not just racism. It's not just xenophobia. It's a mix of these things. And in particular, I'm interested in how demographic change, right? So a place like France, it goes from 3% non-French immigrants to 6%, what that does to attitudes, and then eventually how that shapes politics. And so the demographic change, what I'm interested in is how, under what conditions, contact between immigrant and non-immigrant populations can help and when it hurts, right? And that's where economic threat. In large part, it's about whether or not you feel threatened by these others, right? Whether you think they're going to take your job or your benefits or whatever, right? So it's only gotten worse during the crisis is one implication. I'll start with a classic social psychology theory, contact theory, right? Allport is writing in the late 50s. Some of you all may have studied this in like sociology classes in undergrad. It's basically intergroup contact in the pursuit of mutual or mutually consistent goals undermines jointly held stereotypes and thereby fosters peaceful relations. Okay, so it's if you can contact in a certain way, right? There are conditions, right? You can't. It's not slave owner and slave. That's not going to create good contact, right? Good contact is maybe we work together, maybe we live close by, our kids are in school together, we have positive contact, then we can foster peaceful relations, right? So maybe I meet my first, to take it away from race, right? Maybe I meet my first gay person and I learn about them and I figure out that they're not so different than me and maybe I change my stereotypes about it or whatever, right? The basic core, I think, is one of the simpler theories of political science, which is obviously why, it's a good reason why I like it. Intergroup contact leads to peaceful relations and reduced animosity. So to make it clear, as I move towards the statistics part of it, people write, any type of frequent non-negative contact between the majority-minority groups will reduce prejudicial attitudes, irrespective of the setting or nature of contact, right? So you take this, and you get it to, if there's lots of immigrants around, you're going to have some contact that's going to help. Okay. So an example of this from Allport, right? So this is the 40s and 50s when he's studying this stuff, was actually one of the places where there was forced integration in the U.S. And that was in the Army, right? So it's to actually test the contact theory, it's really useful to have this forced integration in a way where people don't really have the choice necessarily to kind of see whether it has a good or bad effect, okay? So in different platoons, divisions, and regiments, sometimes you get no blacks anywhere in the platoon, all the way to black soldiers in a company, right, in a relatively small unit. And then these two are in between. So this is the key, again, in these, if you're a soldier and you have a black fellow soldier that you didn't have before, right, you have same goals, you're trying to adopt different things, right, that's going to be positive contact in this theoretical thing. And actually, this is a good example of showing it clearly. 60% of soldiers who had no contact with black soldiers disliked integration and wanted no part of it, right? They had no experience with it, but they thought it was bad. They no, you shouldn't do that. Whereas down here, fewer than 10% of soldiers who actually had positive regular contact with black soldiers disliked integration, right? So, and that kind of makes sense, right? You're always going to find people who don't like other people, regardless of what you do. So this is a positive example. Okay, I'm sure you all have read or seen less positive examples, right? There are lots in Allport. There's actually quite a bit since then of studying places where it doesn't quite work, right? There's integration in a workforce. The London Tube is an example of this, where they integrated the workforce and it didn't go so well. It created actually more racial resentment between the two groups. But that's the starting point for the positive story, right? This is the optimistic story. More immigrants, better relations. The less good story is if you get perceived threat from that group, right? And in particular, even Allport talked about threat theory in this way, where intergroup contact can actually intensify conflict if you get resource scarcity and other competition over things like jobs, money, welfare. From this perspective, it's actually the exact opposite prediction. More immigrants will create problems because in regions with larger immigrant populations, there's more of a perceived group threat. Scholars dating back to V.O. Key, who studied the American South, have argued that contact with the other triggers threat perceptions and even contempt, right? So it doesn't have, the perceived is deliberate, right? It's not group threat, it's not actual legitimate threat. It doesn't have to be objective, it's only perceptions. If I think there's a threat, that's enough. That's where those ads come in, right? Politicians are out there screaming about how, well, in this case, like, the immigrants are all bad, they're all taking our jobs, we can't have a welfare state because of that. Lots of European countries have welfare state problems, and it's not because of immigrants, right? There's a wide array of issues with the welfare states. So they're contradictory theories, and that's why I wanted to study this. The theories are contradictory, and unfortunately, the empirical work so far has been quite contradictory as well. Radical right support, so the kinds of parties that make those messages. You could think that people who don't like immigrants are likely to vote for them, right? That's their primary, for many of the parties like the National Front in France, that's their primary issue position. And in fact, in the 90s, research showed that National Front support is positively correlated with foreign-born population, right? If there's a lot of immigrants in your district, Le Pen did pretty well. The National Front did pretty well. So that's an argument for that threat theory, right? On the flip side, when you go down to the micro level, it kind of broke down. The evidence wasn't quite so clear. And in Golder's review of more recent research, he shows that empirical evidence between radical right support and immigrant, it's not at all certain. But that's, again, one of the places I started was I'm interested in these radical right parties and what drives them to success in the cases when they do get success. And so xenophobia plays into that. The other part, the weaknesses of this literature is that they're mostly cross-national studies. So it's mostly comparing, like, Germany has a lot of Turkish immigrants. What does Germany think about immigration? Versus a country, let's say, like Denmark, which has fewer immigrants. What do they think, right? So you're just comparing country to country. What are the country's attitudes? How many immigrants are in there? There's a clear problem with that from the theoretical perspective, right? And I'll show this in maps of France. A country could have a lot of immigrants, but they could be in one city. So for instance, they could only be living in Amsterdam. Well, that means the people in the rest of the Netherlands don't really have all that much opportunity to contact, to have the positive kind of interactions that could reduce anxiety and xenophobia. So it's not, cross-national studies are not really good tests of it. Okay? It ignores the mechanism of the contact theory, and it ignores massive variation in levels of immigration. For instance, in France, the average in the data that I use is 9%, but there are places with fewer than 1% immigrants, Mancha. I'm sure I butchered lots of French pronunciations for people that know better, but so be it. And there's a max of 32%, right, in Saint Denis. So it's hard to make a case that those people in the 1% have any contact, right? Or certainly not objective threat, right? They might have plenty of perceived threat. So to belabor the point, the hypothesis is simply that following the contact theory as local immigrant populations increase, xenophobic attitudes will decrease. Okay? So that's what I'm shooting for. The second part of that, right, is all that discussion about threat, economic threat. And so I have a couple of measures for that. There's objective measures, like unemployment rates. You can imagine if higher unemployment, you'd be more likely to feel threatened about your own job. So that would trigger that part of the theory. And also subjective measures. Do you think you're worse off than you were a year ago? Do you think the French economy is really bad? Stuff like that, right? So to do this, I focused on the French National Election Study, which is 4,000 individual respondents, face-to-face interviews, and I know where they live, more or less, in terms of the department and the commune. If you know France, it's divided into 96 or 100 departments, and then 36,000-ish communes, like smaller regional things. Now the problem, right, as anybody who knows a little bit about France knows, it's illegal to ask people racial identity questions. You can't do it on surveys, you can't do it, academics can't do it, right? And the government doesn't do it. So they actually don't collect data, and so it's hard to do a pure race study. There are sometimes ways around it, but one way around it that I'm using is the census does collect data on foreign-born population. And they track who lives where and where they came from, right? So that's a way for me to, right? I don't know that everyone who moved to France from Algeria is not white French, but I'm just generalizing, I guess. And so I do use a bunch of different variations about different categorizations from the census. I'm not sure, most of you all are probably just starting out. I'm not sure how much statistics you all do. This sort of design has a bunch of different problems. The individuals who live in a particular district are likely to be like other people who live in the district, right? People who live in Chapel Hill share some similarities with other people that live in Chapel Hill that are different than people who live in Chicago, right? You could imagine that people in Chicago have a different set of beliefs about some things than people that live in Chapel Hill, okay? So to get at that part, I can't just use standard regression models. I have to use hierarchical linear models, which looks at both the individual and the contextual analysis. A technique actually made somewhat more easy to use and common in political science by a UNC professor at the time, Marco Steenbergen, who's now in Geneva. But he had a famous article that made this technique approachable for normal statistics users, not high-end methodologists. So the individuals are nested in departments, right? Because I'm interested in how many people live there, what the threat is, and all of these things. If you don't know France, or you haven't been there lately, or never been there, or whatever, this is what the French departments look like. You get, it's a pretty large country for European standards. You get, right, Paris, then you get a few other cities and a few other areas that are large, right? Turns out you get a lot of relatively rural areas of France that have way fewer immigrants. So the first thing that I did is collect the data on the xenophobia and created a scale to try to figure out what xenophobia is. You can probably imagine, if you've done these kind of survey data, that it's actually hard. You can't just walk up to people and ask them, are you racist? It turns out. Most people won't answer that, truthfully. I mean, the people who say no can probably answer it truthfully, but the racists mostly won't answer it, right? And in the US, when you ask racial questions, you get lots of non-answers, lots of evasiveness, and so people that study race in the US have to use really sophisticated techniques to try to get at that, right? How long do you delay before you answer the question? What other kinds of questions do you do? Let's rank order groups and figure out where blacks or Latinos are or whatever, right? So there's sophisticated ways to handle this. It turns out in France it's not quite as politically correct, right? They don't straight up ask if you're racist, but they do ask if you think some races are less talented than others, which is, I mean, I count that as pretty racist, right? There are other questions like whether the presence of immigrants in France is a source of cultural enrichment, right? Now, I'll let you all decide like what you think about these questions. I could actually see someone, a real Francophile, not necessarily being racist, but kind of answering that in a certain way, right? There are questions like whether African immigrants living in France will one day be French like everyone else. Okay, so whether or not it's possible for them to assimilate. My Strasburger couple from earlier would say no, right? And then whether blacks and African immigrants are often treated as second-class citizens. That's a common measure in the US to try to get at this. So in my view, none of these questions are all that close to what I'm getting at. I think the less talented is the most overt. So instead what I did is I tested to see whether they go together, whether they create a latent variable, right? Whether there's some underlying xenophobia, and it turns out that these questions actually go together quite well. And so what I do is I add them together, creating a scale that goes from 0 to 18. Okay, so higher scores, more xenophobic. Here you get some of these departments. The darkest ones, right, go up the highest. The lightest ones are actually no data, but then there's the light blue are the places. And if you notice, right, see these departments, they're smaller than the others. That's around Paris, right? So it turns out that around Paris, where the most immigrants live, that's also an area where there's the least amount of xenophobia relative. I'll show a map with the number of immigrants. But you do get these pockets, right? Clusters, which is kind of interesting. Okay. So what other kinds of things would you think explain xenophobia and racism? What else? This is the interactive part. So you know my story. I want to know about department foreign population share.
Socioeconomic status of the department.
Good. Socioeconomic status of the department. Okay. So how rich an area is or something like that.
Yeah,
So what would be your...
Probably very wealthy, but other areas may be...
So poor, you would expect poor areas to be more likely to be xenophobic?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
And then, or you obviously, because you have high, if you're working in a sort of more corporate area, you're probably working with people similar to, similar to race, such as kind of status, then you're less likely to interact with lower socioeconomic statuses who, at least in the United States, are.
Yeah, I can kind of see both of those because you don't actually interact with a lot of people, perhaps, right? But then, so you might see news about the crime, and maybe the news is biased in a certain way, or you see politicians. But then again, as the first woman said, like they actually aren't that threatened economically, and maybe, I don't know. There's lots of stories for why they wouldn't feel threatened by it, right? Because along with wealth goes education. Right? And it tends to be the case that more educated people are more cosmopolitan, less racist, xenophobic, all of these things, right? Are open to other cultures. Anything else?
Employment rate for the department.
Good. Yeah, unemployment rates ties right into that economic threat, right? Higher unemployment rates is the kind of the inverse of the wealth of the district. If you're in an area that's been hit hard, you're going to be, that actually made me think about something. I'll come back to unemployment. The only one that you all didn't really mention is, then in other work, is party cue, right? So if you're an individual and maybe you're not always sure what to think about some things, a lot of people turn to elites to listen to, right? And in France and Europe more generally, that's still political elites, right? Here, we either turn to, I don't know, Rush Limbaugh or Jon Stewart, depending on your preference, right? You're one way or the other, but you're not necessarily getting all your cues from political parties. You're getting them from all sorts of sources. Political parties play a much more prominent role still in Europe than they do even in the US, where they're still very powerful. So what I do with the party cue is I match up an individual's preferred party. So let's say I'm a National Front voter. The National Front is the most xenophobic. I'd expect that to make me more xenophobic, right? Because I listen to my party, maybe I go to their rallies, maybe I watch their ads. And you get the right-wing party is actually a little on the less xenophobic, and then the socialists, the left-wing party is the most cosmopolitan, whatever the opposite of most xenophobic is. The other problem when you're doing this kind of survey data that you need to think about is you can't exactly ask immigrants if they're xenophobic about immigrants, right? You can, but that's a different story, right? You might be interested in that. But for this purpose, it would complicate it, right? So I need, one advantage of the National Election Survey is that I'm only looking at citizens, okay? But there are lots of citizens in France who are not native born. So I include measures for the things that the surveys do ask about religion and whether or not your family has members living abroad. Okay, so that's a way for me to kind of track. Those people should be less xenophobic on average compared to the other. So here's what the immigration looks like. Again, remember this part was the lowest on the xenophobia scale. It's the highest on the scale of foreign population share. So all I did here is add the census data to the map and spit that out, right? So what's clear from here is you're getting a few pockets of intense immigration in a few cities, right? And then there's some other places. And then you get the West and there's nothing there, right? There's no immigration there, relatively speaking, right? So Strasbourg in the north, there's a bunch along the eastern borders and near Lyon in the southeast. So I didn't put those up before side by side, but here they are side by side. I'm not sure about you, but when I look at this, I don't see clear patterns, right? It's not obvious to me that the places where the immigrants are less or more, right? It's just kind of a mess. It does not yield obvious conclusions. What is clear is that right, these areas have relatively high scores and nobody living there, right? This pops out to me, right? This is a mismatch, right? I don't know. So you can't just look at that. The correlation between the two variables is negative, as the contact theory would predict, but you can't live on that. So what I did was this hierarchical linear model. You don't have to worry too much about this if you're not into tables. It's actually cut in half for your for your benefit. I know the speaker next week, AJ Spoon, and I talked about tables of these things, and a lot of times people will put up like 27 variables at talks. You might see that at some point. You can't, even if you're pretty good at statistics, you can't always get that much out of it. I do want to put a few of the variables, especially the ones that were mentioned earlier, right? So some of the key things are left-right ideology, right? So right-wing people, if you're more conservative, if you're a National Front voter, for instance, you're more likely to be, forget about the stars too, actually. Party Q is positive. As the party gets more xenophobic, the citizen does. No surprise, based on what we were talking about earlier, if the respondent actually considers themselves Muslim, they're less likely to answer those questions that I mentioned, right? That Muslims are second-class citizens, that some races are less talented than others, and questions like that, right? This also is no surprise. Higher educated people are less xenophobic. This is the important one, right? This is the one I care about. Foreign population share. And it turns out that it's negative and it's fairly significant and robust across a bunch of different specifications. And that's, I think, strikes some people, some readers as strange, because the national studies, again, find the opposite. The countries with more immigrants are more xenophobic. In France, at least at the micro level, that's not true, right? And relatively speaking, that's a positive, optimistic story. That's better than the story that a lot of people are telling in Europe, that there's so much fear about immigration. Best case is it's not quite that bad. I'll show you, this is what it looks like, and it drops about 20% if you go from the minimum 0 in your department to 20. The amount of xenophobia on that scale, 0 to 18, drops about 20%. So in departments with larger local immigrant populations, individuals are less likely to strongly agree with all of those xenophobic statements. I'm happy to talk about other models if you all wanted to do that, but the effect is very stable. That negative relationship doesn't go away if you do other things to it, which is good. So I started with a mixed bag of signs of good things, right? I hope, an optimistic story. But there are a lot of signs for conflict in Europe over immigration. I'll talk about this on the next slide, but in the UK, I find a different story. In the UK, more immigrants actually leads to more xenophobia, at least in the preliminary research I've done so far. And I don't really have a good story for why that would be, right? Except that they feel more threatened, right? That there's more perceptions of threat. in East London, an example of conflict is when they were building up to the 2012 Olympics, there were plans for a mega mosque, like I forget if it's a 4,000 or 9,000 seat mosque in East London, that eventually got cast aside by the locals, right? Same thing happens in Switzerland. The Muslim population there wants to build minarets that are high. What's against Swiss building codes to build minarets that are higher than certain buildings? There's conflict over that. In northern Paris, in rough parts of northern Paris, there are fights between Muslims and Jews. In Italian cities where Muslims might be numerous, but many can't vote, the Catholics and secularists have united to stop the erection of mosques. Right, so the building of mosques is a particular sign, in addition to food and other issues. So that's the bad. The good, I think there's a lot of ability in European states to adapt to this. Right, I think we're just in that process now, which is one of the reasons why I want to study it. And I'll tell a story about the food. In France, 16,400 pupils went to go to the primary schools. They found the new lunch menu. Alongside the expected meat dish, what they found is a vegetarian option. Okay, so why is that important? Right, it's not just that they're healthy. I find that a lot of Europeans don't understand vegetarianism. When you go to restaurants, you really have to explain no to the Swedish cook. I don't eat fish. I mean vegetarian, but anyways. It actually wasn't the point to give them vegetarian. The point was an ability to give Muslim children something that they could eat that wasn't meat, right? That wasn't suitable in the halal way. Okay, but in France you can't say that, right? Because it's deliberately no religion in schools, no religion in politics. So you can't say we're going to serve certain foods to Muslim kids and certain foods to Christian kids. That would never fly in France. What you can do is offer an option of that. And so what that did is it flipped it. Before then, about 40% of school children are skipping lunch. Anybody that's read anything about schools and lower education, kids that don't eat don't do well, right? So poor kids don't do well. If you don't sleep and you don't eat, it's really, really bad for your schooling. So this is a big deal for moving forward. The short story is that I think I'm telling an optimistic story that I've already mentioned. It's consistent with the contact theory, that in these departments and in the communes where there's larger immigrant populations, it actually dampens anti-immigrant attitudes. You might ask, so what, right? These are just attitudes, these are just public perceptions. Why does that matter? Fortunately, on this issue more than a lot, public attitudes actually matter quite a bit, right? On the issues of xenophobia and immigration policy, the links are well established, right? What the people think about immigrants matters for public policy. Jennings, for instance, demonstrates that shifts in public policy directly affect, or public attitudes directly affect changes in asylum policy in Britain, like whether or not Britain's going to allow asylum immigrants. Lahav also studies this link between public opinion and immigration policy. So if you're interested in immigration policy, I think you kind of have to do both parts of it. The third part, and I already kind of prefaced this a little bit by talking about the UK, a clear next step in the research is to combine this micro research with cross-national stuff. What I'm long-term interested in is, for instance, why France, it works this way and the UK works the other way. And that's hard because you need survey data that's the same across countries, but at a level low enough where I know where people live. And so that's the way that I'm going to go in the future. If anybody's interested in Q&A, I'm happy to talk about the UK results, but I won't do that now. And I've enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Do you see the opportunity for a policy solution to xenophobia, maybe specific programs that could increase the level of contact that people in the local population have with immigrant communities?
That's a good question. My gut is that there are things that can be done, and I think that's the way that I'm leaning towards trying to explain the French and the British exceptions, right? It's about what the state does to assimilate and integrate immigrants in, whether or not they feel like they're part of society, right, which leads to less resentment and like riots, right? If that's the case, then it should allow for more contact and stuff like that, right? On the other hand, if the state deliberately says, like, we don't really want you here, we build up new things where you have to take tests about whether you speak certain languages or you do certain kinds of cultural things or you know certain things, I think that creates less assimilationist and different attitudes. So yeah, I think it's definitely a back and forth between the two. Yeah.
I was surprised to see that on the map of xenophobia, a region that I lived in France for 3 years is marked as having a relatively high rate of xenophobia, and it's a region where it's heavily rural, but immigrants in the 1960s were...
Where is it, if you don't mind?
It's Franche-Comté, territoire de Beaufort.
Okay.
Immigrants were drawn to this area of France because of the Peugeot auto factory and all of the car parts industries in the region. And I'm sort of wondering, since a lot of the immigrant population arrived in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what effect their children have on racist attitudes in the region. I mean, it might not necessarily be that it's foreign-born immigrants that are creating these perceptions anymore. It might be that there's something else going on in France.
That's a good. Where is that?
It's sort of on the right-hand side, up the right-hand side.
Like up here?
Down a little bit, right there, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think there definitely is a rural-urban thing, right? That's because that contact stuff. It's certainly not going to explain every district, right? And why every district might be. So let's look here. Right, it has higher levels, right, based on that. And again, this is not an ideal this is not actually not a measure of what people think about immigration policy necessarily. This is something different about survey attitudes. And I do think it feeds into how your experiences long term. One of the things I looked at in the UK that I didn't really look at in France is when there are lots of immigrants, did they come all at once? Or was it a slow thing? Or did it... So I remember this, there were people at Duke studying Durham several years ago, and it used to be Durham was basically a city with white and black, right? And the black population had local college, banking industry. It was a vibrant economy. But in the last 20, 25 years or so, Latino immigrants started coming into Durham in much bigger numbers. And so it went from being a white-black city to a white-black-Latino city with lots more conflict in different sorts of ways. And contact didn't help in this situation, right? In that, I remember in particular there was a fight over a church. One particular church where the two neighborhoods were different, right? And created quite a bit of problems. So I think that demographic change would feed into that, right? Whether or not they've been there since the 50s, what kinds of experiences, stuff like that. Did you have a follow-up, or was that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just personally, I'm curious as to how sort of the children of these immigrants feed into these attitudes, because yes, they're minorities, but France doesn't, as you said, France doesn't do any they don't collect any information on that. And so I'm just sort of wondering what the interplay between these two groups is, because obviously, yeah, you have the foreign-born immigrants, and then you have sort of their children that are now becoming a larger and larger part of France. So.
That's right, and if it obviously very much depends if there are ghettos of certain people away from other people, right, or whether there's integrated or segregated living space and stuff like that, and whether the schools are. I remember this Sam Huntington's famous argument about how Latinos can never be part of American culture and they're killing America and all this stuff, right? This famous, very controversial article. And it turns out that the second and third generation Latino immigrants mostly spoke English, mostly bought into the cultural things that Huntington was so scared of. And it looked the facts looked a lot different than what he thought. And it had to do with the second and third generation. This is kind of too, I don't know, too early stage for me to have anything about that.
Okay, so you talked a lot about the effect of national identities being drivers of xenophobia, and after reading about the Fortress Europe approach to integration, it makes me wonder how much the European identity attributes to this sort of xenophobia. Do you think it does at all? European identity as a whole, as opposed to just the national identities?
That's a good question. I do think national identity, so for instance, just looking at these parties, right? The National Front, the UK Independence Party, the Sweden Democrats, the Swiss People's Parties, all of these parties emphasize their national identity, either Switzerland or French or whatever, and are opposed to or opposed to immigrants. Now, at the same time, they are not European, right? They do not, they're opposed to European identity for the most part, not all of them, but many of them are, and deliberately because of this. So what I would say is it's the opposite, that those people who have, this is what Gary Marks and Lisbeth Hoga have written a lot about from here, about for people who have inclusive identities, right? If you think of yourself as French and European, you're probably more likely to be okay with immigrants. I didn't test that, but that's a good way to look at it. And I think that as European identity keeps creeping up, right, more and more people see themselves as at least European in some sense, right? And in some cases, it's actually gone to European first in some countries. I think that will feed into it. The other side, right, the nationalists, the exclusive nationalists, what Gary and Lisbeth would call exclusive nationalists, you're only French, right? You're opposed to Europe precisely because it allows immigrants in, right? Because of the Polish plumber and the different people coming from different places, right?
I suppose I mean outside of what is Europe. I know a lot of the problems that people have with enlargement for Turkey is that Turkey is that other. They don't share the same sort of religion necessarily, and they look different.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is European is becoming a lot more inclusive in that sense and against some of the people who are outside, I guess is what I was getting at.
I think I see what you're saying, but the people who see themselves as European, who have that sense of identity, tend to be more open on other things too, right? So they're not closed off to external European, relatively speaking, right? I mean, there's a lot of opposition to Turkish enlargement among all groups, so that's not to say, anyways.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your UK results because among my British friends, I was interested if you incorporated not just Muslim immigration or diverse culture immigration, but it seems among my friends that are British, they have an animosity towards Polish immigration, and they were untreated individuals. That seems to be more of an issue to them than Muslim or an opposing cultural immigration. Not a more European culture. They have more animosity in that sense.
There's definitely a sense of, not just in the UK, but in a lot of Western European countries, right? When the enlargement happens, everybody's free mobility and stuff, but there were lots of restrictions against the new members, especially Poland, because Poland's so big. And in the UK in particular, that dynamic has been big. I think it's overblown, and partly political parties use this to their advantage, and other kind of media and stuff like that, right? The Polish population in the UK isn't that big, but it is prominent in the sense of the way people think about it. I think what I more looked at is non-white population, so not Poles. It's Pakistani, Indian, Caribbean, people like that, who all of whom are kind of grouped together in the British way of looking at things. But this is what it looks like this is what the non-white population looks like in Britain, right? And just like in France, you're talking about particular clusters around a few cities. So London, you get some in Manchester, a very few in the big cities in Scotland, and the rest is there's just nobody there. No immigrants, and look at that. I mean, Northern Ireland is very homogeneous. Ireland as a whole is super homogeneous, but Northern Ireland in particular is. Yeah, just to show you, this is what, right? It's also a very modest effect, and so the other paper has been vetted many more times, and so I'm way more confident in the results. This one I'm not as confident in, and I think I need to play around with it a little more to make sure it's stable. Yeah.
Do you think, so you talked a lot about how xenophobia and racism are connected, but I was wondering, what you think of what recent developments, how they're affecting that, especially with the Euro crisis. Worker mobility is becoming a whole new issue because suddenly Europeans start thinking differently about how homogenous, how socioeconomically homogenous the EU is. And I mean, my sense was that there was relatively little xenophobia against other EU citizens because there's a sense that they're not a threat. There's less of a perception of a threat because they're really just like us in every respect. They're also like us in terms of education and socioeconomic standing. But now with the Euro crisis, countries like Germany are experiencing a lot of immigration from Greece and from Southern Europe, and those are almost economic refugees. And I was wondering whether you think that might change something.
That's a great point. I think absolutely the crisis, all of these survey data, because I was trying to match it up with census, right? Census has only happened every 10 years. This is all pre-crisis. So the new stuff that I'm looking at is kind of mid-crisis, 2010-ish. But I think you're right to a degree about the xenophobia not being so much about Western Europeans. I think most Western Europeans are quite okay with Western European immigrants. I think many of them, the evidence shows, are pretty skeptical and suspicious of East European immigrants at times. Like, not all of them, right? It depends on the country they're coming from. Poles is the biggest one, right? It was a big deal when enlargement, all over France, you saw posters of the Polish plumber. They're going to come and take your jobs, right? Poland gets it because they're bigger. But not so much in the West. Now that changed in the crisis. And like, I was in a little town in Germany, Heidelberg. Like, you would think that's a German town, right? It's not that big. Lots of the people that worked in the bars were Spanish. There were lots of Spaniards there working. And that actually, this is just pure anecdote. I didn't notice a lot of tension about that because Germany needs workers too, right? So Germany doesn't have that economic threat component towards the Spaniards, at least. There's a little bit more towards the Turks. But I do think that will continue to increase. I think it's worse against some countries than others. So definitely the target, I think your point, that would be the point that I take away. The target country matters, right? The host versus the target. There's a lot of resentment toward Greeks that isn't quite there for Spaniards in Germany, for instance, because there's a perception of guilt on the part of the Greeks from Germany that's not there from towards Spain, right?
Yeah, this question may sound a little weird, but based on
I like weird
what you just
questions.
mentioned, the target countries, the different actual groups of people that come to the countries. Have you looked at the different attitudes or the different objectives that each one of those immigration groups have? And what I mean is, for example, some immigrate because they really want to truly assimilate with the culture. Okay, then there's others, they go into another country in a more opportunistic way. They just want to go work there, make money, send it back home, or some just go there to commit crimes, to being drug traders or stuff like that. Have you looked at that and how that may factor into?
So the second group was opportunistic, like wanting economic opportunity. The first group was people who want to be part of a different culture, or want to join French, want to be French, go to France and be part of the whole thing.
Right. Because I think there's a distinction, and I say that because I'm an immigrant myself, and I consider myself as someone who has fully assimilated to the American culture. But I've noticed a lot of people, that their personality and just their general opinion is like, well, I'm not from this country, I don't really care, I love my country, I miss my country, blah, blah, blah. Yet they're still here, and I imagine the same thing happens in Europe.
I think that's a great point, and it somewhat gets, I might be able to look at it with the UK French, but you don't get quite precise enough survey data. So what would be nice is if you target different groups, like some are more or less isolated once they get here, right? Some, like you said, just join the schools, whatever. Others will move and stick to one neighborhood, right, where you live in that neighborhood and all the signs are in the language, right? You can do this in Chinatown in New York City, or in my hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, has an area where lots of Vietnamese people live, right? There's lots of stores with Vietnamese signs and everything else, right? There's not really all that much attempt to assimilate. And I think that feeds into whether or not there's any positive contact in what people think about it. So that's one big part of it. And I think you're right that that's who you're exposed to. And this might go back to the point that the gentleman brought up about, like near Peugeot, those immigrants, right? They might have been more involved, and then more recent immigrants may not be, right? So he kind of knew people who were like, yeah, of course we have friends from other places. I can't really explain any single one. Whereas like some groups might not be into that, or some groups might be associated, stereotyped with crime, right? So I think right now, Romania and Bulgaria have like some stereotypes about, like, if the immigrants come in, like, what are they doing? Why are they coming here and stuff like that? Those stereotypes like are not accurate, but that's what contact is meant to do. You actually have to meet some people if you have this image in your head of what Russian gangsters are like or whatever, right? Some Russians move in, well, you get to know them, and then you figure out they're not actually gangsters. So not all Russians are gangsters, and you go from there. But yeah, so and that's where I think it's tough to separate the subjective and the objective part, right? Whether or not immigrants actually contribute to crime or not is one question, right? Do immigrants in a local community contribute to crime in a meaningful way? Most of the evidence is not so clear on that. There's almost not that much evidence that they positively contribute to it, not like make it worse. I'm mixing up my metaphors here. I don't think the evidence is clear that they make it worse, right? For the most part, they don't contribute to crime on a normal, in most places. But that doesn't matter, right? It only matters whether people think they do. So if the crime rate goes up, and you see different people, right? The Strasburger couple who's like, those people aren't Alsatians. There's crime downtown. And you do get lots of pickpockets and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of stereotypes. You hear this. I was in Spain with some undergrads, and that's one of the things the guides will tell you, right? Watch your pockets in the main city squares, and they always list certain groups, right? Depending on which country you go to, the target group is different. Like sometimes it's Roma, sometimes it's Romanians, sometimes it's Algerians or whatever, right? There's always some group.
I'm wondering if you've taken into consideration or what role you think historical reason why various different groups move to different countries, what that might play. For example, you have countries like the UK and France that have really strong post-colonial migration groups, and then you have countries like Germany that have guest worker groups, and then you have Scandinavia where there's large asylum-seeking groups. Mm-hmm. And what role that plays both from the perspective of immigrants coming to a country and also from local populations responding.
I am really interested in that. I haven't really looked at it that much, but that's actually what surprised me about Britain, because they've had a really long history with a lot of their immigrant population, right? They have a long history with India, with Pakistan, and with the Caribbean. And that's where a lot of the immigrants are from, but there's still quite a bit of tension over those issues. And I think I don't really have good answers for it, but I do think the target group, why they're coming, this point earlier about opportunistic, some refugees, right? People are treated very differently. In Syracuse, where I live now, right, there are not that many immigrants, period, right? There's almost no Latinos up in central New York and stuff like that. But there are particular immigrant groups, right? There's a big Catholic charity, and so there's the Sudanese Lost Boys. That's one of the areas in the U.S. that they live. And so there are pockets of immigrants, but they're from particular places, and they have a connection with each other that's different than just people moving to the U.S. to get the golden streets or whatever. I forget the imagery, right? You just move because you want to be part of the land of opportunity. Those people are much different than refugees or guest workers. And then the guest workers are different than the second generation guest workers who the parents stay on when the people, maybe the host country didn't want that, right? They just wanted guest workers to come and go. Yeah, there's a bunch of moving parts, which makes it interesting, but also very, very tricky. Yeah?
When you were doing your Was there a specific distaste for a specific color, or was it a specific country? And especially was it race related or was it nationality? Is sort of my
First of all, this is not my survey, right? This is a national election survey that they run. It's useful for me because it's nationally representative and random and all that. I definitely would have worded questions differently if I was controlling it. But there is a little bit of survey evidence about who people think about when they have immigrants, right? Because you can think about those questions like, are immigrants good for your culture? Are immigrants bad for crime, right? If in my head, and I'm in France, and I think of Germans, right, I'm not going to think that Germans contribute to crime, right? So if in my head, when the surveyor asks me about immigrants, I think German, I have a very different image than if I think Algerian, right? It turns out most people think of extra-European immigrants when they answer those questions. And so that simplifies what I'm doing a little bit, right? Because I don't have to tease that out quite as much. The second part of your question was interesting, but I've spaced on it.
I guess I just that's the same thing. Was it based on race and nationality?
Oh, yeah, I actually get into trouble with some of my European academic friends because they don't like to think of this as race. But I see it coming from the U.S. and it looks a lot like racism to me. But they would say it's more about ethnicity, more about religious things like this. So the Netherlands is a good example. A country known all over as extremely tolerant on many dimensions, right? Drugs and like the red light district in Amsterdam is just one example, right? But they're tolerant about everything. But the conflict that comes in with, I've read numbers, 50% of school children in Amsterdam are Muslim. Okay, so they fear, the Dutch fear, that the Muslim kids and the Muslim parents are not tolerant towards some of the things that Dutch people think are quite okay, right? Like drugs, homosexuality, other stuff, right? And so there's this clash. They're kind of intolerant of tolerance, and so there's that component that's kind of a religious, cultural stuff, and then there's also racial, ethnic. It's kind of a mix. But I think there is a big, my gut is that there's a big racial component to it. I think that drives a lot of it. But my European friends sometimes disagree. Yeah?
You mentioned that there might be some based on different attitudes towards people in that nation. Do you have any information about that? Or how that might contribute to, the nation's attitudes towards the immigrants itself, if that makes sense?
That's a great question, and you were very lucky because Rasan Maxwell teaches here. I think he's 2 weeks in as a new tenured faculty in political science, and he has a very extensive, impressive CV filled with articles about attitudes of immigrants. And in particular, he has a couple papers about France and then some cross-national stuff, looking at how they feel about being assimilated in, whether they want to be assimilated in, and all those things. So he has a book. His name's Rasan, R-A-H-S-A-A-N Maxwell. He has a book, several articles, and I think that's a good entry point, actually. To answer the second part of your question is, I absolutely think that's part of it, right? That there's this dynamic between whether or not the immigrant group is happy and content and feel incorporated, and whether or not the host country people want them in, right? So if there's that's where conflict could come in, I think. And reading his stuff on the way here, actually, it kind of sparked some ideas about. I think that could be contributing into why it works one way in France and a different way in the UK, right? And as I kind of extend it out to more and more countries, I want to look at whether or not the immigrant community feels assimilated, feels disgruntled in a way, and also what the policies are. So add that to the fact of like which groups are they? Why are they there? Are they there because of opportunity, or refugee, or guest worker, or whatever? Right? I think those dynamics are important to explain cross-national stuff.
Could there be a correlation between the country that is receiving immigrants, the socioeconomic status
status of the country, whether it's in crisis or not. And if it's receiving, because I believe there's like a dilemma when receiving workers that are more qualified or workers that are prone to get into crime if they're unemployed. So there's a dilemma whether the workers are going to cause crime or they're going to take high-end positions. If the country is of high economic status, then they probably would fear more the crime than high positions. And if the country is of low economic status, then they would probably fear the people taking the high-end jobs. Is there a possibility that there's like sort of a correlation?
I see what you're. So the question is really is the host countries like characteristics drawing certain kinds of immigrants, like and whether the reaction to that is positive or negative. So are the immigrants high status, like doctors and engineers, or are they manual laborers? Right. It turns out like this is not what I studied, but there's a rich literature on this. Shivi at Yale studies this, and other people do. It turns out everyone wants educated, high-status immigrants. But they don't go to places where they're going to take the jobs away from locals so much, right? Those people, when they immigrate, tend to go to rich countries to get more opportunities. So that it's more of a, I would say the problem is more brain drain from the sending immigration country than it is worries. Like people don't worry about more doctors coming into an African country, for instance. That I think that would be accepted. Now the other part is like how many manual laborers can a country handle? I think for the most part, like more than they think or more than they want. I think immigrants drive economic growth and economic success. I think if you compare immigration patterns in Europe and in the U.S., I think a lot of economists would argue that the U.S. relative openness to immigration over the last 50 years contributes quite a bit to its economic success, right? If you look at the engineering, the patents, and all that stuff, right? If you look at patents like in Silicon Valley, it's not all white Americans who are doing those patents. It's not at all, right? It's a lot of immigrants who are, which obviously leads to the fear that the last 10 or 15 years of more restrictive U.S. policy towards immigration is kind of bad for that. But Europe has been a little bit more closed towards external immigration in a lot of ways than the U.S. was. And I think that's one of the reasons. That's one of the places that started, right? That the birth rates stagnate. The birth rates stagnate. You need more workers, but then they don't always want the workers they get. Yeah.
You spoke earlier about potential policy changes in the EU. Being a bit of a pessimist, I'm not sure if you see that on the horizon. Wondering more optimistically regarding the practical application of the contact theory. Do you think that if immigration increases in Europe, that eventually we'll see a decrease in xenophobia, or do you think that eventually there will have to be policy changes if Europe ever gets around to it?
So starting with the last part, I think immigration is increased. Like regardless of whether they want it or not, I think all European countries are getting much more diverse, and that's not going to slow down. I think you're right to be pessimistic about politicians. I think some countries will start to try to close their borders, and others will remain open. I don't think that Europe is a very diverse place itself, like among the countries, very different attitudes, very different strategies, politics, everything else. So I would not hazard a guess about what all European countries will do. I think some will be more open and some will not, and they'll experiment, which is, I think is, I mean, of course, like from a normative sense, I wish more countries would just be open to immigration. I think it's a better policy, but I don't expect that. I think you're right. And I think countries are starting to try to do more policies to integrate people in. And some of those will be successful and some won't. It depends on the group, right? It depends on whether they want to be assimilated. That's part of the story in Turkey and Turkish immigrants in Germany. some of them do want and some of them don't, and it complicates it.
Of course, but in regards to things like, with laws about how high you can build a temple or laws against stuff in public or in schools, those are the kind of policy changes I'm interested in. Like, do you see, what do you think will have to happen in order for those things to change? Because I imagine that with an increase in immigrants, you'll have a stronger people on the left pushing for more egalitarian laws like that. But, and again, I know it's country.
Best case, you're right. You get more. Every country has different voting laws, like whether immigrants can vote or not. That obviously matters. The more they can vote, the longer the run, so some stuff will start to change. I think the hijab and burqa stuff is very country specific. I think I don't get the impression that that's going to change anytime soon in a place like France, although I think you do see some kind of non-policy kind of, they don't stop as many people as they should legally, right? You're supposed to stop everybody and make them show their face and show their ID or whatever. I forget the exact rules, but the cops don't do that. Switzerland is I think, a positive response story to you, right? So Switzerland had referendum about this, right? So the people actually got to vote about whether or not the minarets could be built higher than the tallest church from 1810 or whatever. I forget the rule, but it turns out that the districts where more Muslims lived voted for the minarets, that the minarets could be built. It was the homogeneous districts that didn't want them. So that, I hang my hat on the happy stories. Yeah. But the problem is the left is not very outspoken on this. They tend to just, they don't make a good case for immigration, I don't think, and they don't make a good case for diversity, by and large, in a lot of European countries. The right makes a very powerful, very simple story, right? They are the cause of, you name the problem, immigrants are the cause, right? For crime, they made the EU, they don't like regulation, they took your jobs away, the crisis, everything, right? And I think the left needs more powerful people making better arguments.
You've mentioned a few times the phenomenon of immigrant groups living segregated in their own communities, especially in large cities. Did you, in your studies, see any instances of cities where the immigrant population might be lower, but because of the lack of an established immigrant community, the level of contact with local native European origin citizens was higher than in a city that might have a higher number of immigrants that's very segregated?
That's a great point. No, I did not, is the answer. You'd need to do field work and go and hang out. It's kind of like the answer to the story about the Peugeot factory. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that's not the kind of work that I do. But that's why I like, Maxwell's a little bit like, Maxwell School where I teach is a little bit like the Center for European Studies and GEC here, right? Where you actually get lots of different disciplines. So, that's why I go and hang out with the geographer and get his stories about Strasbourg that help me understand a little bit more of the numbers. One thing I did look at, and this struck me when I lived in Chicago. So the people that live in Chicago, the city's segregated. Of course, it's segregated to a certain degree, but it's actually kind of a patchwork city, where you get like poor, rich, black, white, and there is a lot of interaction. And so the grocery store that we went to, it was the only time I went to a grocery store where I was like a clear minority, right? Not at all, not even close to a plurality, right? Mostly black. But the white people that lived in the area that I lived in Hyde Park around University of Chicago, of course it's highly educated, right? It's a particular kind of crowd. But even the not university folks were very cosmopolitan, very open, interacted with people from all races and stuff like that. You go outside of Chicago to some of the suburbs, and it's mostly white, if you get out to the suburbs, and don't have a lot of interaction. And you talk to people out there, this is just anecdotal, but are scared of Chicago, right? And are scared of crime. Why? Because the 6 o'clock news will freak you out if you watch it. I mean, there's just nothing but scary stuff on there, right? People getting kidnapped and people dying, especially in Chicago, which is a pretty crime-ridden city. So I actually looked at that, though. I looked at places where you had a heterogeneous district surrounded by homogeneous, right? So I was wondering if that's what was driving it, right? My Chicago suburbs example in my head. And it's not that, actually, because there's most of the time the districts that are heterogeneous are around other districts that are also that way. Now, if you get down to the neighborhood level, it changes, for sure. Jacob?
Curious how you define xenophobia. Some of the cases you mentioned, I would personally not categorize as xenophobia. With religion that centuries, a certain architecture, legitimate argument that in terms of tradition, a certain architecture might be kept, not necessarily in a way that we don't want you here, but in a matter of tradition. Also, the burqa discussion has some legitimate reasons, in my opinion, to question whether this form of clothes can be applied to a democratic society. That's legitimate questions. So, where do you draw the line? How do you specifically define xenophobia?
That's a good question. Those are examples that I think are complicated, right? Because the tradition of the skyline in certain cities being like capped with a church or whatever, or just no religion in France, for instance. Like there's no crosses on buildings. There's no, like, it's not favoring Christian. It's just not that. I think that the sad answer is that it's hard, right? The easier answer is I think some people voted against the minarets because they're xenophobic. And I think some people were just in it for the culture. And so that's why it's hard to, that's one of the reasons why in the survey data at least, I cobbled together a bunch of questions. And if you're one way on some questions, but then not on the rest, right, you're going to be on this side, right? That's why it's questions about, what were some of them? Whether there are too many immigrants, right? That could actually be an objective question. If I know a lot about immigrants, then I think we might actually have enough. Maybe that doesn't make me, I think that does. But anyways, like in most of these questions, not the race is less talented, but the other ones, you could come up with a plausible story just like you did about the burqas, right? Taken together, it points in a certain direction, right? Yeah.
I'm curious about the education systems, and you talked a lot about how like minority youth can feel excluded. And I'm wondering if there are any types of programs in these schools to help children. Like I went to school in Greensboro for the past 4 years, and they have a lot of they have a school designed just for refugee children, to teach them about the culture and to show them, this is how to ride the bus, this is like how you go to the store. But I'm just wondering if there are any types of programs like that.
That's a great question. Rassam Maxwell would know the answer. I don't really know the answer to that. My instinct is that some countries are going to be better at that than others. I don't think France has a ton of programs like that, but I could be wrong. I don't want to say. I think the places where they do are going to be better at integrating them and assimilating them and accommodating different types of people. And so those communities, even if it's on a community by community level, which I think is likely, like Greensboro does that, but other cities might not do that, right? It's not a U.S.-wide thing. I think that's the kind of positive policy that would, best case, you would kind of move towards. Has anybody not asked that still has? Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about the relationship between the welfare state and the integration level of immigrants in Europe, because I think there's a big differences if you look at countries, how well they integrate, because there are differences how well they're supported by the states.
It's a good question about welfare state politics and immigration. I think there's a great book that Erica and I were talking about last night by Alberto Alesina, an economist at Harvard, who talks about why the U.S. doesn't have a big welfare state, and most European countries do. And he has a bunch of different stories. Like one of them is that Americans, by and large, think people are unlucky because they're lazy, or not hardworking or whatever, Europeans think you're poor often because you're unlucky, which is a very different attitude about it, right? I could be unlucky tomorrow and wake up poor. I'm not going to be poor because I don't work hard, right? I know myself, I work hard, right? That's not going to happen. So from the American perspective, if you think people are poor because of that, so that's one big explanation for why the welfare states are so different. The other, though, is diversity, right? And at the state level, at the district level, everything in the U.S. U.S. is more diverse historically, and it was more diverse in the 30s and 40s when the welfare states were really being built. That explains like people's willingness to provide public goods for others is lower. Like it's a sad finding that's pretty robust. I think a lot of European countries, when they were building the welfare states, were pretty homogeneous. Like if you think about Sweden in 1930, there weren't a lot of non-Swedish looking people. And I'm really interested in that in the next 20, 30 years, what that does to the welfare states there. Like whether or not increased diversity makes people less likely to. A lot of places, it's just like, okay, you're in the country, you can join in. Other places are creating more restrictions for who gets the benefits, what kind of benefits, what you have to do to get the benefits. And I think there's a lot of room for bad political rhetoric about it, right? That I think the evidence in a few countries that I've seen is that immigrants are not like just sitting at the welfare stand, like sucking all the money out of it. Instead, it's they contribute taxes like everybody else, and they take some of the benefits, but not an inordinate amount. But that's not the impression you got from that video I showed, right? They're taking all the money from that poor old Swedish grandma. And so it definitely depends on the rhetoric. But if I studied welfare state politics, that's what I would be interested in right now.
Speaking of the US, what do you think the increase in Xenophobia post 9/11 has contributed to European discourses, and how do you think those xenophobic discourses have interacted beyond Europe, between Europe and the US? And we've seen increased debates about increasingly xenophobic debates in Europe, like with the burqas and the minarets.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think, how do you think those discourses feed on each other?
I don't know how much like 9/11 itself affected it, but just the general trends towards like the securitization of lots of things like air travel and everything else is ramped up at all. I think what it does is it creates another tool in the arsenal of political elites who don't like immigrants to say, they come, they're going to form, like this happened in Britain when they had a few bombings, right? It's all about who's doing that and blaming certain groups, right? And I do think that feeds into the Islamophobia. I think you're right. I think the war on terror, the larger war on terror, it has to, I think, feed into people's perceptions and the political rhetoric about it. But I don't know. Hopefully, we're on the downward slope from that.
I was wondering if your study looked at differences among xenophobic attitudes between age groups, like how if one age group is more xenophobic than others.
What would be your guess?
I would think that older people are more xenophobic, obviously.
That's right.
But
was
that any?
It's as simple as that.
Yeah, but was that included in your study at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, actually, women are more xenophobic, and which surprises me, but might speak to like perceptions of threat and stuff like that. But old people, yeah. The standard controls for this kind of thing are old, gender, income, education, stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that, is there something that might help explain why some rural areas that don't have very large immigrant communities tend to have more xenophobia? Because there are more young people that are moving into cities to universities.
I think that's right. Like a lot of younger people move to the cities. Cosmopolitan. I mean, I think you're right. Yeah. I don't know off the top. I think the education patterns are going to be different in different parts of. I mean, just thinking about what it's like how many people go to college in urban areas versus rural areas, depends on the type and stuff like that.
We're out of time, but thank you, Seth, for a great talk and for so many great questions.
Yes, that was great. I partially answered some of them.